Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, traditional Japanese steel, part 2. So I'm taking up here where part 1 of this Tamahagane making video left off. In part 1, I started with steel that I had smelted and then consolidated it, forge welded, and folded it about 7 or 8 times to reach a reasonably clean consolidated form in the shape of this billet right here. Now we'll go to phase 2 of the processing, where we take 2 separate billets of steel harvested from 2 different smelts, and we'll combine them to form the ultimate really clean piece of steel that will be used to forge an actual sword. I want to make sure that the 2 different billets are sort of interleaved together so that each layer is adjacent to one from a different billet. Also, I want to give myself the absolute best chance for success in the final billet, so I make sure that the best surfaces are facing outward. You know, if there are any problems whatsoever, I want them to be inside the bar. I want the ends of the billets to be closest to the handle because that's where the most problematic welds and possibilities of incorporating some of the tack welding material might be. Everything's carefully organized for the most likelihood of success here. The truth is, there are just a lot of potential failure points here, and you really want to make sure with the absurd amount of work that goes into one of these things that you don't screw up anywhere by overlooking some little detail. Because the 2 billets will have slightly different carbon contents, they'll form layers that contrast slightly in appearance when they're polished. There are also a variety of forging techniques that can be employed to make subtle changes in the patterns that the steel will eventually display. Unlike in the first half of this video, this time I won't be using reasonably traditional Japanese forging techniques at all. Instead, I'll work with the steel just like I do when forge welding modern style Damascus. I'll do that by chopping up the 2 billets, which have been carefully flattened to uniform widths. Grind them nice and flat, then tack weld them and forge weld them again. It's critical here that absolutely none of the tack welding material ends up in the final billet. So, each time I finish forging out the billets, the residual tack weld material has to be vigilantly ground away. Then the billet's chopped up again, cleaned of scale, tack welded, and reforge welded. After each fold, the steel is drawn out and very carefully flattened and straightened by hand to make sure that everything lines up correctly on subsequent welds. This basic step, chopping, cleaning, stacking, and rewelding, is repeated 3 times, at which point the intended layer count is reached. In this case, I'm aiming for about 250 layers, because each of those layers contains around 1,000 layers from the initial phase of forging. The final layer count actually amounts to between several hundred thousand and 1 million layers of steel, depending on how you do each step and kind of how you count it. And here's the final result. A bar of steel that looks like something you could buy from a steel supply house for about 12 bucks. How much labor was involved? I really couldn't even begin to guess. Each smelt alone probably takes about 30 man-hours, maybe more. Then, all the forge welding is probably another 40 hours of work. At the price you'd pay a decent car mechanic or plumber, well, you're getting into the thousands of dollars worth of labor, and you haven't even made a sword yet. So you can see why these are so expensive to make. After a rough etch with ferric chloride, here's a bit of a window into the appearance of the steel. Those stripes represent different layers. The brighter blobs towards the tip are tack weld material, which will be ground away. Once the sword is forged and compressed into its final shape, those layers will show up quite differently. They won't be quite so stripy, but that's how they look right now. Just to give you a little more math here, I basically started with 300 pounds of charcoal and 100 pounds of ore, which then reduced to about 30 pounds of bloom steel or Tamahagane during 2 separate smelts. For this particular project, I started with 10 pounds of that raw Tamahagane steel, which reduced to less than 2 pounds of workable steel. Now, I had some problems related to the fact that my forge needed relining in phase 1 of this project, and that resulted in some bad welds, which made me lose a bit more material than I otherwise would have. But the point is, you're getting somewhere in the neighborhood of a pound of sword for every 100 pounds of material that you start with at the very beginning. So, I hope you found that interesting. I've tried to explain at least some of the steps where my technique departs from traditional Japanese approaches. These are just my techniques and perspectives. That said, I believe a key point here is understanding that the Japanese sword is not a monolith. Among Japanese smiths and sword enthusiasts, there's a certain sense of orthodoxy about how they're made today. But I bet if you went back 400 years, you'd have found a lot more technical diversity among Japanese smiths than you do today. That said, the techniques that I showed here work for me and result in a sword that's comparable in most essential qualities to a traditionally forged Japanese sword. Alright, once I complete it, I'll do a follow-up about the sword that this piece of steel ends up turning into. I'll add a link when I get there, so check the description for that. Thanks for watching, and see you soon. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe and make sure that you click on that bell so you get notified of all the latest videos. Want to buy a knife from me? Check out my modern blades at tacticsarmory.com. Digging the channel? You can support our video making efforts on Patreon. You know, I've been banging away on these videos for like 10 years, so I hope you'll show some love for all that hard work. Link in the cards and descriptions. Finally, if you're interested in making Japanese swords, check out my full line of Japanese sword videos where I show how to forge Japanese swords as well as how to polish them and how to make fittings, handles, and scabbards. WalterSorrellsBlades.com.